Sir, this seat isn't for people like you. The sentence dropped like a bomb. Within seconds, the luxury cabin went silent. It was boarding time for Flight 728 from JFK to San Francisco, a high-end business route operated by Skybridge Airlines. Passengers in the first-class cabin were already sipping their champagne, adjusting their recliners and preparing for a smooth 5-hour journey. Soft jazz played overhead, and the scent of leather seats filled the air. Then walked in a man who didn't fit the image. He looked around 50 African-American dressed in a faded white shirt, worn-out khakis and sneakers. A rugged canvas backpack hung off his right shoulder. He wasn't loud. He didn't smile. He didn't carry a briefcase or sport a Rolex. He simply moved with quiet confidence, scanning the row numbers before stopping at Seat 1A, first row window seat first class. He placed his backpack gently in the overhead bin, then sat down. Seconds later, a young flight attendant named Ashley approached him. Blonde, immaculately groomed in her early 30s, Ashley prided herself on her work in first class. She flashed a quick smile, though her tone was anything but friendly. "Excuse me, sir. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man nodded politely and handed her his ticket without hesitation. "Yes, it says 1A. Ashley took one glance at the ticket. Something about the whole situation bothered her. Maybe it was his appearance. Maybe it was the way he didn't fit the mold of her usual high-class flyers. She raised an eyebrow. "I think there's been a mistake. This seat isn't typically for people like you." The sentence hit like ice. The nearby passengers turned to look. The woman in seat 1B, a well-dressed corporate executive in a red blazer, let out a condescending chuckle. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "He must be lost." Ashley straightened her back. "Sir, I'll ask you to stand by while we double-check your seat. Please step aside. We'll figure this out quickly." The man, still calm, stood up and said nothing. Instead, he took out his phone and typed a single text. "Issue in first class. Seat 1A. Handle immediately." 4 minutes passed. The buzz in first class had started to escalate, with whispers flying around like mosquitoes in a summer field. Then came David Collins, Regional Operations Director for Skybridge Airlines. Dressed in a sleek gray suit with a silver badge clipped to his belt, David boarded the aircraft briskly. He didn't look left or right. His eyes scanned the row until he spotted Ashley and the man standing quietly beside her. "Ashley," he said sharply, "step off the plane with me, now." Ashley blinked, stunned. David turned to the man, and in front of the entire cabin, he gave a respectful bow of the head. "Mr. Miles, sir, we're terribly sorry. Your seat is ready. Everything is under control." That was the first moment the other passengers started connecting the dots. "Mr. Miles," one of them echoed. "Wait, is that the Miles?" David, without hesitation, turned toward the rest of the first-class cabin and raised his voice just enough. "For those of you who don't recognize him, this is Mr. Jonathan Miles, founder and current chairman of Skybridge Airlines." The silence that followed was absolute. Ashley's face turned ghost white. The woman in seat 1B looked away in embarrassment. Jonathan Miles, a name not commonly known by the public but deeply respected in aviation circles. What many didn't realize was that before Skybridge became one of the fastest-growing airlines in North America, Jonathan had been a public school teacher in Bronx, New York for nearly 20 years. He had grown up in foster care, put himself through college, and taught high school math with passion and discipline. He used to take 2 buses every morning just to reach a classroom filled with underfunded desks and overworked dreams. It wasn't until he turned 48 that he invested his life savings into a charter flight business. Slowly, painfully, he grew at first 3 planes, then 12, then regional routes. 10 years later, he launched Skybridge Airlines with a mission to treat every customer with dignity, no matter what they wore or where they came from. He believed in invisible wealth, not in diamonds, but in integrity. And today, here he stood still, dressing like a school teacher, still humble, still quiet, being mistaken as someone unworthy of a first-class seat on his own airline. Ashley, mortified, opened her mouth to speak, but Jonathan raised his hand. "Don't apologize," he said softly. "I just hope next time you think twice before judging someone based on what they wear. Some of us built this airline so others wouldn't have to feel like that ever again." Then he turned, sat down in 1A, pulled out a folder labeled Teacher Grant Program, Q3 Draft, and continued reading as if nothing had happened. The cabin remained silent, but every single person aboard would remember what just happened for a very, very long time. The cabin had returned to its calm state, at least on the surface. But beneath the polished smiles and folded napkins, the passengers in first class were still stealing glances at the man in seat 1A. Jonathan Miles. Most of them had never seen his face. His name was familiar to a few, especially those in business media or the aviation world, but his appearance didn't match the persona they had expected. No tailored suits, no designer shoes. Just a quiet man now, calmly reading a folder labeled Teacher Grant Proposal, Q3. Ashley hadn't returned to the cabin. Her absence was noticeable, and so was the shift in everyone's posture. David Collins, the director who had intervened, stood at the front of the cabin for a few moments longer, speaking to a senior crew member before heading back toward the gate. Before he left, he gave Jonathan a respectful nod. Jonathan responded with the smallest of smiles, gracious but restrained. Across the aisle, a young man in his 30s leaned toward Jonathan. "Sir, I had no idea you were the guy behind Skybridge," he said. "I've flown with your airline for years. My mom was a public school teacher. You changed her life with your free flight program." Jonathan looked up. "What was her name?" "Deborah Langley. She taught English in Oakland." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I remember her. She wrote a letter once. Said it was the first vacation she'd had in 18 years. The man smiled in awe. "She talks about you like you're a legend." Jonathan chuckled. "I'm just a guy who never forgot where he came from." That line echoed in the cabin. For a few passengers, it planted a seed of shame. They realized that just moments ago they dismissed him based on his clothes. Some had quietly agreed with Ashley when she tried to remove him. Now they sat with guilt in their throats. But Jonathan wasn't thinking about that. As he flipped through the pages of his folder, his mind traveled back to a small classroom in the Bronx. Room 107, cracked windows, a broken clock that always showed 2:17, a chalkboard that screeched every time he wrote, and 22 students, each one struggling not just with math, but with life. Back then he wasn't Mr. Miles' chairman. He was just Mr. Miles, the math teacher who brought in extra snacks, who stayed after class for kids who had no internet at home, and who wore the same 3 shirts on rotation. He remembered the late nights grading papers by candlelight during blackouts. He remembered the students who confided in him, telling him about evictions, hunger, and missing parents. He remembered the day one student asked him, "Sir, why do you try so hard when nobody else does?" And he remembered his answer. "Because somebody has to show you what you're worth. If not me, then who?" In 2013, he left teaching not because he wanted to, but because he had a vision. A local charter flight company in financial ruin had gone up for sale. No one wanted it. Jonathan saw potential. Everyone thought he was crazy. A school teacher with no business background trying to run an airline, but he cashed out his retirement fund, sold his car, and borrowed what he could from former students. For 5 years, he worked from a shared desk in a co-working space. He did the books. He designed the training manuals. He interviewed pilots. He negotiated fuel contracts. He personally handled customer service calls during holidays. He once apologized to a woman for her broken seatbelt from a payphone at midnight. By 2019, Skybridge had 10 planes. By 2022, it had 200. And now in 2025, it was among the top 5 domestic airlines in the U.S., known not just for its reliability, but for its values. He had implemented programs to give teachers, veterans, and single parents discounts and access to upgrades. He made sure every employee went through bias training, and he funded scholarships for youth in underserved neighborhoods who dreamed of flying. Yet today, even on his own aircraft, he'd been told, "This seat isn't for people like you." A soft knock on his seat interrupted his thoughts. It was another flight attendant, Marcus, a tall black man, probably in his early 40s with a kind face and eyes that carried an apology before he even spoke. "Mr. Miles," he said quietly, "I'm very sorry for what happened earlier. If there's anything I can do." Jonathan smiled, folded his folder, and looked up. "Just tell me one thing," he said. Marcus nodded. "Anything." "How long have you been working here?" "6 years, sir." "Do they treat you with respect?" Marcus paused. "Mostly, but sometimes people assume things." Jonathan nodded. "That's why we're not done yet." Marcus gave a faint smile. "Thank you for being who you are, sir." Jonathan extended a hand. "Thank you for staying." Meanwhile, at the rear of the plane, Ashley sat in the crew station, staring blankly at the beverage cart. She hadn't been fired yet, but she knew the call was coming. She didn't need a warning. She knew she had misjudged, spoken without thinking, and represented the very thing Skybridge claimed to stand against. She had read the training manuals. She had signed the ethics agreement. She had even watched Jonathan Miles give a virtual speech during onboarding orientation. But it was easy to forget those things when you're focused on appearances. And now she had embarrassed herself not just professionally, but morally. Back in 1A, Jonathan returned to his proposal draft. He underlined a line that read, "Education doesn't end at graduation. It follows us into every moment we choose to treat someone better than we were treated." As the captain made his final announcements and the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Jonathan glanced out the window. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need anyone fired. What he needed was change, sustainable long-term change. And that, he thought, didn't begin in boardrooms. It began in cabins like this with moments like this. By the time Flight 728 had reached cruising altitude, the passengers in first class had settled into an unusual silence. The normal hum of conversation was replaced by hushed tones and stolen glances. Everyone was still processing what had happened before takeoff. Jonathan Miles sat in 1A, not touching the glass of sparkling water in front of him. His hands were gently folded over a thin folder resting on his lap. He had read it twice already, but his mind wasn't in the document anymore. Across the aisle, the young man whose mother had been a teacher glanced over and gave a soft nod. Jonathan acknowledged it with a quiet smile. The connection had been made. It didn't need words. At that moment, a familiar voice returned to the cabin. Ashley. She had composed herself, pulled her hair back tighter, and straightened her Navy uniform. But there was no hiding the change in her energy. Her usually confident stride was now measured, cautious. She approached Jonathan from the aisle and paused a step away, clutching her tablet to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Miles," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'd like to apologize." And again, Jonathan looked up slowly, not cold but unreadable. Ashley continued, "I misjudged. There's no excuse. It wasn't professional, and it certainly wasn't fair." She didn't expect him to respond kindly. In fact, part of her was ready for him to ask for her termination on the spot. But he didn't. He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Sit." Ashley blinked. "Sir, please." She hesitated, then carefully sat in seat 1B, her posture rigid. Jonathan leaned slightly toward her, still calm. "You know what my first job was?" he asked. Ashley shook her head. "I was a janitor, nights, age 16. I used to clean classrooms in a school I couldn't afford to attend." He let that sit for a moment. "One night a teacher stayed late. I was mopping near her desk and she looked up and said, 'You have the eyes of someone who thinks deeply. Don't let this floor be your ceiling.'" Ashley lowered her gaze. "I never forgot that," he said. "That one sentence changed how I saw myself." He turned to look directly at her. "Do you know what sentence you gave me today?" Ashley swallowed. "You said, 'This seat isn't for people like you.'" She looked like she was about to cry. Jonathan continued, "I've spent the last 20 years building something that's supposed to stand for dignity, for inclusion, for possibility. And in 30 seconds, you told me I didn't belong. Not because of who I am, but because of what you saw." Ashley's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." "I believe you," he said. "But belief alone doesn't change behavior." She looked up surprised. "So here's what I want from you," he said. "Don't ask me not to report you. I already chose not to. Don't ask for forgiveness. I've already given it." He leaned back. "Instead, do something harder, change." Ashley looked at him speechless. "Every person who steps on this plane deserves a clean slate," Jonathan said. "You have one now. Use it." She nodded slowly, wiping the corner of her eye. "I will." They sat in silence for a moment before she quietly stood. "Thank you for your grace." "Make it count," he replied. As she walked away, something in her changed, not just embarrassment, but a genuine sense of awakening. What had begun as a routine shift now felt like the most important moment of her professional life. Meanwhile, toward the back of first class, Marcus, the senior flight attendant who had spoken to Jonathan earlier, approached quietly. "Mr. Miles, the captain, has offered to meet you after landing, if you'd like." "That's kind," Jonathan said, "but unnecessary." Marcus gave a nod. "Would you mind if I asked, why don't you fly private?" Jonathan smiled. "I like being where the real people are." He chuckled, then added, "Besides, you learn more from watching people when they don't know who you are." Marcus grinned. "That's a powerful kind of listening." Jonathan nodded. "It is. And sometimes it leads to powerful conversations." About an hour into the flight, a woman from the main cabin, probably in her early 60s, with a pleasant face and nervous hands, was escorted to the front. "Excuse me," she said timidly to Marcus. "Is it true? Is he really Mr. Miles?" Marcus nodded gently. "Would you like to say hello?" She turned red. "Oh, no, I couldn't. I just wanted to say thank you. I'm a retired teacher from Tulsa. My son used your teacher flight benefit last year to fly me to his wedding. I hadn't flown in 20 years. Marcus smiled. "I'll make sure he knows." Back in 1A, Jonathan felt something shift, not in the plane, but in the people. All around him, small gestures began to surface. A man in a suit helped a flight attendant lift a bag. A young woman offered her snacks to the child across the aisle. Even the usual air of superiority that lingered in first class had given way to something quieter. Respect, maybe even gratitude. Jonathan leaned his head back and exhaled slowly. He wasn't a preacher, a politician, or a celebrity, but in moments like this, he remembered what power really looked like. It wasn't being feared, it wasn't being praised. It was being seen and choosing to see others in return. The plane glided smoothly above the clouds, sunlight casting golden streaks across the first-class cabin. A calm stillness had taken hold, not the usual corporate silence, but something deeper, a collective reflection. Jonathan Miles had returned to his seat once again, resting his hands over the folder in his lap. The meeting with Ashley had left him contemplative, yet strangely hopeful. People could change if given the right moment. And sometimes that moment came at 35,000 feet. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Marcus and another senior crew member, Elena, reviewed the passenger notes. She had joined midway through the flight and missed the pre-boarding incident. "What happened with 1A?" she asked softly. Marcus glanced at the manifest, then over his shoulder. "That's Jonathan Miles, the chairman." Elena's eyes widened. "The Jonathan Miles?" Marcus nodded. "There was an incident before takeoff. Ashley didn't recognize him. Made a mistake." Elena didn't pry. She just closed the tablet slowly. "He's flying commercial." "He always does," Marcus said. "Takes the same seat, keeps quiet, watches." That explains a lot. Back in the cabin, a flight attendant from economy gently stepped forward, carrying a handwritten card. She looked no older than 25, likely new to the job. "Mr. Miles." Jonathan looked up. "Hi, I'm Leah. I just wanted to say thank you." She handed him the card, blushing. "My mom teaches third grade in Detroit. Last year, she got a travel voucher from your airline, used it to visit her brother, who was in hospice. It was the last time they saw each other." Jonathan blinked, absorbing the weight of that sentence. "She always says, that flight changed her life. She wanted me to tell you." Jonathan opened the card slowly. Inside was a simple message. "To the man who gave us time we wouldn't have had, thank you. Susan and Leah Parker." He didn't speak. He simply pressed the card to his chest. "Please thank her for me," he said quietly. "And thank you for being here." Leah smiled, her eyes moist. "I'm proud to work for you, sir." Another hour passed. A few passengers dozed off. Others scrolled through their in-flight screens. But in 1A, Jonathan stared out the window, lost in memory. He remembered his very first flight. It was on a budget airline in the last row, seat wouldn't recline. He was 23. A non-profit had flown him out to speak at a youth conference in Chicago. He wore the only dress shirt he owned and spent 2 hours rehearsing his speech in a bathroom mirror at the airport. He had been terrified. No one had believed in him. But when he took the stage, he saw a boy in the front row, with a look he recognized, curiosity masked by fear. That boy came up after and said, "You made me feel smart." Jonathan had never forgotten it. Now, decades later, the man who once swept school hallways and flew in broken seats was running an airline, yet still being told he didn't belong. He glanced again at the seatbelt sign, then at the rows in front of him. Somewhere along the way, this seat had become more than a place to sit. It had become a symbol. As the descent began into San Francisco, Ashley returned to the front of the cabin one last time. She approached Jonathan not as a flight attendant, but as someone asking for permission to grow. "Mr. Miles," she said quietly, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but..." He turned to her, calm. "Yes, sir. Can I tell you what I realized?" He gave a slight nod. She took a breath. "I became a flight attendant because I wanted to travel. But I forgot that every seat I walk past belongs to a story I don't know. I saw your shirt and your bag, and I saw a mistake." She paused. "But what I didn't see was everything that got you here. I want to get better at seeing." Jonathan studied her face for a moment. "Then you're already on your way." Ashley nodded slowly. "Thank you for the second chance." "Use it well," he replied, "and pass it forward." She straightened, but before turning, she said something unexpected. "I'll never forget that you spoke to me like a teacher, not a boss." That made Jonathan smile genuinely. "That's because I'll always be a teacher first." When the wheels touched down at SFO, the cabin erupted in the usual polite applause. But something was different. People weren't just relieved to arrive. They seemed lighter, like passengers who had taken a journey that didn't end on the runway. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a special guest on board today, Mr. Jonathan Miles, the founder of Skybridge Airlines. On behalf of every crew member, past and present, Thank you, sir, for reminding us what this airline is really about. There was no fanfare, no music, no flashing lights. Just a soft murmur of respect and a few teary smiles. As Jonathan disembarked, passengers let him pass first. Some placed a hand on his shoulder. Others whispered simple thank yous. One child waved, not knowing who he was, but sensing something different. At the jet bridge, Marcus met him once more. You sure you don't want an escort, sir? No need, Jonathan said, adjusting his backpack. I'm just another traveler. Marcus smiled. That's what makes you unforgettable. Jonathan paused, turned back for one last glance at the plane, and nodded. Take care of her. Every seat tells a story. And then he walked away quietly, humbly, just as he'd come. The living room was filled with late afternoon sunlight, casting golden stripes across the floor, where papers were carefully stacked. Deborah Langley sat at her kitchen table, smiling at the boarding pass she held in her hand, like it was a certificate of hope. Her laptop was open, the screen displaying lesson plans she had revised for months. And now, for the first time in her life, they would travel further than her classroom walls. Nairobi, she whispered to herself. Never thought I'd go further than New Orleans. Just last year, she had applied for the Skybridge Educator Global Fellowship almost as a dare to herself. Her son had pushed her. Ma, you always tell your students to take risks, he'd said. Time you listen to yourself. Now here she was preparing to board a flight that would take her across oceans to learn to teach and to finally live a dream she had shelved for decades in the name of responsibility. She picked up her phone and sent a message. Mr. Miles, if you're reading this, just know you didn't give me a ticket, you gave me a new chapter. Thank you. She didn't expect a reply, but she wanted him to know. Somehow that felt important. That same evening, Jonathan Miles sat at a quiet bench in Golden Gate Park, sipping coffee from a paper cup. He had always loved this place, an island of stillness in the rush of San Francisco. Children laughed in the distance. An elderly man played a saxophone near the duck pond. Jonathan checked his phone. One new message. He opened it, read Deborah's words, and exhaled slowly. A new chapter, he murmured. His thoughts wandered to how many more chapters had yet to be written. How many teachers, janitors, nurses, and students were just waiting for someone to say, you deserve to be seen. Not rewarded, not rescued. Just us seen. Back at Skybridge headquarters, the evening shift hummed quietly as the operations team monitored the schedule board. David Collins, the same director who had intervened during Jonathan's flight, sat in his office overlooking the control floor. A new recruit entered, holding a printed proposal. Sir, we've got something interesting. A mentorship program submitted under the internal suggestions portal. No name attached, but the structure's impressive. It's about onboarding new hires with retired educators as coaches. David skimmed it, eyebrows raised. This is good. Should we follow up with HR? David nodded. Do that, and forward a copy to Mr. Miles. I think this one matters. The young staffer hesitated. Does Mr. Miles still read these? David smiled. He reads everything. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Detroit, Leah Parker, the young flight attendant who had delivered her mother's note to Jonathan, was on a video call with her mom. You look like a pro, Susan beamed from her kitchen. That uniform suits you. Leah laughed. I still get nervous during the safety demo. You made me proud, baby. Leah hesitated. Mom, today I met the man who made that Nairobi flight possible for you. I handed him your note. Susan's eyes softened. Did he say anything? He said thank you. That's enough, Susan replied. That's more than enough. Over in Oakland, the school board was finalizing the itinerary for Deborah's international exchange. They had booked classroom visits, recorded interviews, and even organized a local TV spot to feature her story. But what Deborah didn't know yet was this. A young journalist named Rafael Dominguez, who had once been in Deborah's math class 15 years ago, was assigned to cover her journey. When he saw her name, he froze. Ms. Langley. She taught me the quadratic formula and how to believe in myself, he told his editor. I want this story. His editor agreed. Rafael didn't tell Deborah right away. He wanted to surprise her with a story she deserved. And then there was Ashley, the blonde flight attendant who had once made the most humiliating mistake of her career, was now studying late into the night. A new notebook lay on her bed, pages filled with scribbled notes. Impressions, truth. Awareness must be active. Change isn't immediate, but it's visible. She had signed up for Skybridge's Dignity First internal training voluntarily and requested to be moved to mentor probationary crew members. She wanted to teach them what she had learned the hard way. That judgment is easy. Respect takes work. At the Skybridge Foundation, a staffer walked into the archive room with a thick envelope. Inside were printed letters, handwritten, typed, emailed, all addressed to one person. Chairman Miles, thank you. They came from all over, teachers from Appalachia, nurses from Phoenix, a single dad from Florida who got to see his son graduate thanks to a last-minute flight credit. The foundation stored every single one. Today, the newest letter was filed, and on the envelope in blue pen were 6 simple words. You helped me lift my eyes. As night fell across the city, Jonathan stood on the rooftop of his apartment building. The skyline shimmered. Somewhere a plane blinked red in the sky, cutting through clouds. He placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "Still flying." He wasn't talking about the airline. He was talking about the mission, the belief, the unseen lives being changed one seat, one story at a time. The skyline of San Francisco glimmered behind him like a sea of quiet witnesses. Jonathan Miles stood still on the rooftop, hand over heart, his eyes following the blinking light of a plane crossing the stars. He didn't know where it was going or who was inside, but he believed deeply that someone in that cabin had a story just like his. A story of being overlooked, a story of being underestimated, a story waiting for its seat. His phone buzzed in his pocket. One new email, subject about today. It was from Ashley. Dear Mr. Miles, today changed me. I wanted you to know that your words didn't just land, they took root. I've enrolled in our leadership mentorship. I've asked to mentor new hires, not to teach them how to serve champagne, but how to treat every guest with honor. I can't undo what I said to you, but I can make sure no one else ever hears those words again. Thank you for speaking to me like a teacher, not a CEO. Ashley. He closed the message and smiled, tucking the phone away. Far below, life carried on. Horns honked, buses passed, streetlights changed. But up here, time seemed to slow down. He wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or market shares. He was thinking about that one boy in the Bronx 20 years ago who had asked him after class, "Mr. Miles, do people like us ever get to fly first class?" Back then, he'd said, "One day I hope we won't need to ask that question anymore." Tonight, it felt one step closer. The next morning, the world moved on as usual, but small ripples had begun to echo outward. In Oakland, Deborah Langley boarded her flight to Nairobi. As she crossed the jet bridge, she paused, looking at the airplane door like it was the threshold to a new identity. She wasn't just a teacher now, she was an ambassador of knowledge, proof that dreams didn't retire with age. In Detroit, Leah Parker posted a photo of her mom's handwritten note and wrote, "This is what legacy looks like. Thank you, Mr. Miles. We fly because you did." Within hours, it was shared hundreds of times by educators across the country. In Tulsa, Susan Parker received a visitor from her knitting group. The woman handed her a printed article from a news blog. The Quiet Founder, How One Man Redefined Airline Culture. Susan read it twice and wept both times. Back at Skybridge headquarters, David Collins walked into the weekly executive meeting with a new idea. "I want to launch an internal campaign, Every Seat Has a Story. Staff will share one customer moment that changed their view. No filters, no scripts." Someone asked, "What's the purpose?" David smiled. "To remind us that we're not moving people, we're moving lives." The room went silent. Then they nodded. Later that afternoon, Jonathan visited a local elementary school in San Mateo. No cameras, no press. Just him and a worn backpack filled with books and model airplanes. He sat on a tiny chair in a classroom painted with stars and asked the kids one question. "If you could fly anywhere, where would you go?" Hands shot up. "Brazil, the moon, my grandma's house in Ohio." Jonathan chuckled. "And why would you go?" A little girl answered, "To tell her I miss her and that I learned to read." He paused, heart caught. "That's the best reason I've ever heard." Before he left behind a handwritten note taped to the classroom wall. "Your story deserves to go far. Don't let fear clip your wings." That evening, while walking past a downtown bus stop, Jonathan heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Miles." He turned. A young woman approached, holding a phone. "I saw your TED Talk years ago. It's the reason I became a flight instructor. I just wanted to say thank you." He nodded slowly. "I'm honored. You flying now." Every day she beamed. "And every time I sit in that cockpit, I remember your words. Don't fly to escape, fly to become." Jonathan smiled. That was a line he wrote in a journal 15 years ago. He didn't know it had traveled this far. As the sun dipped behind the bay again, casting the city in hues of gold and purple, Jonathan returned to his rooftop. But this time he wasn't alone. His son Derek, now a high school science teacher, stood beside him, arms crossed, the same quiet fire in his eyes. "You still watching planes, Dad?" Jonathan chuckled. "Always." "You ever get tired of flying?" "Not the kind I believe in." They stood in silence. Then Derek asked something unexpected. Think I could take over the fellowship program someday? Jonathan turned moved. You want to do her? It's our name, our mission. I want to help it grow. Jonathan looked up at the sky. A new flight passed overhead, just blinking lights in the dark. Then let's keep building the runway, he said, for everyone who still thinks they don't belong. And with that, the story of Jonathan Miles didn't end. It took off again. Not in headlines, not in speeches, but in the unseen places. In a mother's seat by a hospice bed, in a teacher's smile at an African school, in a flight attendant's choice to speak with kindness, in the quiet hand over a heart as the city sleeps below. Because at the end of the day, every seat has a story. And some stories, they lift us all.